The techniques we use when form drawing are nothing really special. There's nothing really that's going on that is anything different to drawing. It's just that we are breaking down all the forms into sort of as simple representations of that complex form as we can. So, the classic sort of example is that, an arm sort of becomes a cylinder. Now, why do we need sort of a cylinder as opposed to but I can just draw an arm like this? So the difference here is that this doesn't explain form. It explains the difference between this edge and this edge, basically. What can happen here is if I, basically, and if I change a little line here, then it might sort of appear like now this sort of shape is going this way, and that it's kind of going this way, if that makes sense. So this form is kind of three-dimensional in this sense. But, if I draw the same thing again, it could also be that I'm looking up at this form and this arm is kind of going away from me. So I've kind of got a hand here, or in this case, we kind of have hand here. So just the contour doesn't actually give us any information. And not only does it not give us information as a drawing, it doesn't help us plan. It's not a good tool to think about where limbs are going and what's happening. So if we think about a cylinder and we sort of conceive of how a cylinder is made, this way we can sort of start to think about the contours involved in drawing something, and it becomes a lot easier to sort of plan. Say, so in this case, this other arm that's kind of pivoting sort of here might sort of come down, and we can sort of see it like that, or it might be kind of foreshortening, and it might be kind of like this. So in this case, again, I'm thinking about it as a cylinder, right? And it's coming at me, and again, there'll be a hand on the end of it. So this is a much better way to kind of think about where things are in your image if you're trying to draw this, because certainly, if you have a really good angle on or understanding of how these forms go, you can draw them without kind of calculating all of the perspective and what's going on and drawing the form and stuff. But especially when you're starting out, it's quite difficult to do that with a limited kind of experience drawing things. It's not like you've already put in 20,000 hours of drawing and you've got a really good understanding of all these muscles, and it's possible to be like, yeah, well, actually, this is kind of boring, because I've done this 100 times before, this exact pose. That's very different. So we think about form as having dimension and always kind of drawing sort of these simple forms. And if I can do this here, then it's a lot easier for me to kind of add, secondary forms and think about sort of, okay, we've got maybe a sort of some different arm muscles here. And, I can actually sort of start to think about where the muscles are and how they're sort of placed. I can sort of think of them as being sort of, separate sort of cylinders, or like a stretched out sphere or something. And if you're experienced with rendering these simple surfaces, then we can start to kind of get to the point where we can describe how these forms are shaded and what happens when they kind of meet each other. And again, it's very complicated to kind of plot it out every time. You don't need to do it every time, but it's important to understand what's happening with form and muscles and anatomy and all sorts of things like that. So let's take a simple example just to kind of illustrate this point, right? Let's take some kind of random shapes. Okay. So there's no form here, right? There's nothing. But let's sort of start to think about some form. So, this is kind of just a blob, but let's try and give it some sort of dimension by sort of cutting some sort of contour lines around it and trying to find the form, find what's kind of happening there. So you can see that this kind of gives us a sort of a feel for what's happening. And if I were to render this, it's now a bit easier because I can kind of feel these contours. Again, these ones are ones where we could be looking at a multitude of different forms depending on kind of how I break up this form. So, and again, here we could try and sort of break this up sort of a bit differently. So this way I'm going to sort of say that so in this case, what's happening is that we've kind of got a bit of a crease in the form here. So this underside of it might be a bit kind of more shaded. Might have, this form might be sort of similar to the other one. Might have some kind of sort of cast shadow or something under there. Again, cutting some other lines to kind of feel the contour of it. So again, depending on kind of how you, and this rendering is kind of fairly arbitrary, but depending on how you kind of think about the form in there, these shapes can be very different. So it's important to understand that the contour of a shape is very descriptive, and especially if it describes something like a hand or an arm, we can actually pick up quite easily, especially if it's sort of silhouette. We're actually very good at picking up forms in silhouette, but only if they're iconic, only if it's something we know. So again, this one could be sort of going into space, kind of like this. And, maybe this side, this thing here could be going that way. Or it could be kind of like here. Or all sorts of other things could be happening. You don't know. So it's important to kind of think about the form, think about what's kind of happening. So again, it's sort of similar thing here. Depending on kind of how I sort of break this up, it's going to be sort of hard for me to see what's happening with this form. So again, maybe if light's coming from this way, we could sort of shade this a bit differently. Again. And just by kind of playing around and sort of changing things that are happening in here, I can drastically change the form of like what this thing looks like, just sort of based on nothing really. So it's important again to understand. Again, this one we could sort of be like this. Or it could be something else. Again, this one could be sort of anything. So again, a lot of these just abstract forms. And before they were kind of abstract shapes. So that's why it's important to kind of form draw. And this is kind of really how it works, is that we need to kind of combine the concept of the shape that something creates, the silhouette that something creates, with kind of how that form is sitting in space. And all that we do is that we kind of try and break something down into its component sort of objects. So it's simply the way of doing that again is if it's a human figure, you kind of try and break down the sort of major shapes. You might say, okay, we've got kind of a box for a torso. We've got another box for the hips. We've got kind of cylinders for the legs, etc., etc. So then we can apply perspective a lot easier. It's a lot simpler for us to draw. Cylinder for we've got kind of a cylinder for the head, maybe with a bit of a sort of extension on it. Have a ball, sphere for the shoulders. So again, what's happened is that over the years, people have actually developed quite good ways of breaking down the form, and that's often where one of those books like the Bridgman book, the Andrew Loomis book, the Bern Hogarth books, those can be really useful. Again, I mean, I quite like the Andrew Loomis book. I think it's got the best drawing combined with teaching out of the three. Some of the Bridgman book doesn't have quite the level of sort of good finished drawing that the Loomis book does, and I think the Bern Hogarth book is very good at breaking down forms. Not quite so accurate as the Loomis book when it comes to actually drawing them. But this is the idea, is that we sort of figure out what things are, and we kind of break them down, and then we can draw them, and then we can understand and say like, oh, no, like let's keep this roughly the same, but this guy maybe he's raising his arm this time, and kind of scratching his head. Although if he's scratching his head, it might be like a slightly different sort of posture. So that's the basic idea, is that we break it down. And again, you would do the same with a car. You'd kind of break it into sort of, let's take a kind of a simple car. And then you kind of have cylinders for wheels. Etc. And you just break down these lines further and further. And it's possible to draw quite complex curved lines. but we need to break things down to their simple shapes. What's another one that's kind of quite simple? Let's think about a house. House is quite a simple form. Just break it down. We can also break down things like trees. And you can break them down to different degrees. So we've got this like trunk of a tree, which is a cylinder, and then we've got kind of the foliage of a tree, and that might be a sphere. And although these might be gross oversimplifications, they do let us sort of just plan images and get things going, and then we can sort of, add extra elements, like you can add, a garden shed, or, like an extra tree somewhere, or, you can add sort of different types of architecture, and we just kind of keep going. We can make the roof sort of, it's just a matter of extrapolating from those simple forms. But being able to put the basic one in is really the hardest bit when it comes to planning an image. And planning an image in terms of form is one of the most important things. Just getting it right initially. So those are the basic techniques. It's just remember to kind of draw through. You can see I kind of haven't all the time, which is probably not the best thing, but always sort of try and draw through and find what's happening on other sides of your form. But especially kind of draw through just in general, make sure you kind of know, if you're drawing a human and you kind of want to, make and draw hair and stuff, make sure you kind of draw the skull first, locate the ears. Even if you're going to put, some crazy hair or a headband on that's going to cover them, just make sure you draw all that structural stuff first, because it helps you place things which go on top. And yeah, that's about it. It's really just about understanding form. It's much more of an intellectual exercise than it is something that is technically based. But the key thing to take away is that the contour itself doesn't describe an object adequately for us to render it. And you need to consider this other aspect as well. And when we're drawing and sort of calculating things, because drawing is actually, it's a good way. Drawing in terms of, doing things with line and stuff is a good way to kind of plan an image. Is that, we can't sort of draw with tone all the time. And we don't always have time to render everything in complex ways. And even if you're doing this with paint, it still applies, is that we're going to paint first a kind of a simple cylinder, which we know we can do, and then we're going to modify it. But getting the lighting on a simple cylinder right is a lot easier than getting it right on a complex thing. So we kind of progressively step forward, and the simpler you can break it down, the easier your life will be, basically. And the more ability you'll have to break down drawing problems and solve them.